The clink of silver on bone china was the only sound Maya allowed herself to focus on. It was a rhythm, a metronome marking the careful choreography of her shift at Celeste. Plate down, water refilled, crumbs cleared with a silent sweep of her tool. Her movements were economical, practiced into a state of fluid grace that belied the ache in her feet. She wore her uniform, a crisp white shirt and a starched black apron, like armor. It was a costume that allowed her to be both visible and invisible, a necessary paradox for survival in a place like this. Tonight, the air was different. It was heavier, charged with the kind of pressure that precedes a storm. The source was Table 7, tucked into the darkest corner of the dining room. 3 men, all Korean, sat in a triangle of silent warfare. Their suits were immaculate, dark fabrics that seemed to drink the low light. They spoke in low, guttural tones, their language a familiar melody to Maya's ears from years of study and immersion with her best friend's family. 2 of the men were agitated, their hands gesturing, their words sharp and pleading. The 3rd man did not move. He was the center of gravity, the stillness around which their frantic energy orbited. He sat with his back to the wall, a king surveying his court. His suit was charcoal, a Tom Ford cut, so precisely it looked molded to the lean, hard lines of his body. His hands rested on the table, one on either side of a glass of untouched whiskey. They were beautiful hands, long-fingered and steady, but there was a chilling stillness to them, as if they were accustomed to ending arguments far more permanently than with words. Maya had been watching him all night, not out of attraction but out of a primal sense of caution. He moved like the world owed him space, and the world seemed to agree. When he looked up, his eyes swept the room with an unnerving, predatory calm. They were dark, almost black, and they missed nothing. She saw them track the busboy, dismiss the sommelier, and linger for a fraction of a second too long on the security camera in the corner. This was a man who understood angles, vulnerabilities, and exits. She approached their table to clear the main course, keeping her eyes downcast, her presence meant to be as unobtrusive as a whisper. The men switched to Korean, their voices dropping lower, assuming privacy. Maya's mind, however, translated automatically. "He will not wait forever, Jin-woo," the man on the left said, his voice strained. The shipment was compromised. It was Park's fault, not ours. The man at the center, Jin-woo, did not respond. He simply tilted his head, a minuscule gesture that somehow amplified the menace in the air. "Park assured us the port was secure," the second man added, his tone verging on desperate. "He said the transfer on Tuesday was a guarantee." Maya's hands stilled for a barest second over a plate. She knew the port they were talking about. Her uncle was a supervisor there. A detail, small and insignificant, snagged in her memory. The second man, perhaps sensing he was losing, made a fatal error. He switched to heavily accented English, a clumsy attempt to project an air of legitimate business for any potential eavesdroppers. "The situation is under control. It is a minor logistics issue at the terminal," he waved a dismissive hand. "We will handle it." The words were a lie, and the casualness of it was an insult to the silent man's intelligence. It was that arrogance that did it. Without thinking, without meaning to, Maya acted. As she lifted the last plate, her voice was low and steady, the Korean formal and perfect. "Forgive my interruption, sir." All 3 men froze. She didn't look at Jin-woo, keeping her gaze fixed on the man who had spoken. "But the southern terminal is closed for fumigation on Tuesdays. All commercial traffic is rerouted." Silence. It was not an empty silence. It was a solid thing, a weight that pressed down on the table, on the room, on the very air in Maya's lungs. The 2 men stared at her, their faces pale with a mixture of shock and sheer terror. They had been exposed, not by a rival or a wire, but by the waitress. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her eyes. She met the gaze of the man at the center of the storm. Kwon Jin-woo's eyes were not angry. They were not surprised. They were assessing. Cold, dark, and utterly unreadable, they pinned her in place. It felt like being studied by a wolf. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The other two men scrambled to their feet, bowing hastily before practically fleeing the dining room. They left without a backward glance. Jin-woo remained seated, his gaze unwavering. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She had just signed her own death warrant. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, an excuse, anything. But there was nothing. She forced her body to complete the task, to turn and walk away, but his voice stopped her. It was quiet, yet it cut through the muted restaurant noise with surgical precision. He spoke in Korean. "You have excellent hearing." She stopped, her back to him. "Bring the check," he commanded. "And then, you will wait. We have things to discuss." Her shift ended at midnight. The entire time, she felt his eyes on her, a physical pressure against her back. She went through the motions of closing out her section, her hands shaking so badly she could barely sign her name on her final report. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to slip out the back, call a cab, and disappear. But she knew, with a chilling certainty, that disappearing from a man like Kwon Jin-woo was not possible. He was not a man you ran from. He was a man who decided if you were allowed to leave. When she finally pushed through the employee exit into the cool night air of the alley, it was waiting. A black Audi sedan, silent and sleek like a shark. The engine was off, but the car's presence was a declaration. A man in a dark suit stepped out from the driver's side and opened the rear passenger door. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The open door was not an invitation. It was a summons. Maya's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The point of no return. She took one step, then another, her worn work shoes scuffing on the grimy pavement. She slid into the leather interior. The door closed with a soft, final thud, sealing her inside. Kwon Jin-woo was sitting opposite her. The confined space of the car seemed to shrink around him, amplifying his presence. He smelled of cedarwood and something cold, like winter air. He hadn't moved. He was simply watching her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. The car pulled away from the curb with impossible smoothness, gliding into the city's glittering river of traffic. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threats. Maya stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of her life slide by like scenes from a movie she was no longer in. They drove not to a warehouse or a derelict building, but to the city's most exclusive residential tower. The car descended into a private garage, and they rode a silent elevator that opened directly into a penthouse. The apartment was vast and cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a breathtaking panorama of the city, but the inside was sterile. Black leather, chrome, and glass. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter. It was not a home. It was a fortress, a beautiful, empty cage. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a low sofa. His voice was the same as it was in the restaurant, calm, quiet, and absolute. Maya sat on the edge of the cushion, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He walked to the window, his back to her, and stared out at the city he so clearly owned. "Who are you?" he asked, the question sharp. "My name is Maya," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "That is not what I asked. I asked who you are. Who do you work for?" "I'm a student. At the city college. I work at Celeste to pay my tuition." He turned slowly. "And your Korean is fluent? A student of linguistics?" "Something like that. I just picked it up." She kept her answers simple, honest. Lying to this man felt like a fool's errand. He would see right through it. He walked toward her, his step silent on the polished concrete floor. He stopped in front of her, forcing her to crane her neck to look up at him. "You picked a dangerous night to show off your hobby." His proximity was overwhelming. She could see the faint trace of a scar near his temple, mostly hidden by his perfectly cut black hair. She could see the texture of the fabric of his suit. He was real, and the danger he represented was suffocatingly real. "I wasn't showing off," she said, meeting his gaze. "Your associate was lying. I thought you should know." A flicker of something, surprise? Interest? Crossed his face before it was gone. "Why?" "Because lies get people into trouble," she said simply. "And he seemed determined to get you into a lot of it." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers for something. Deceit, ambition, a threat. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find or fail to find. The tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. "The man they spoke of, Park," he said, his voice dropping. "He was my brother. Not by blood, but by oath. He betrayed that oath." He paused, and for the first time, a crack appeared in his glacial composure. A shadow of raw pain ghosted across his features. "His mistake cost me someone. Her name was Sujin." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with loss. Sujin, the woman he had failed to protect. That was his wound, the vulnerability he kept hidden beneath layers of tailored wool and cold control. Maya saw it, and in that moment, she understood that his danger was not born of malice, but of a pain so deep it had been forged into a weapon. Just then, his phone buzzed, a harsh sound in the quiet room. He pulled it from his pocket, his eyes scanning the screen. The muscles in his jaw tightened. "There's been an attack," he said, his voice flat and cold again, the moment of vulnerability gone as quickly as it had come. "The rival family your friends were so eager to dismiss." He looked at her, and she knew what was coming. "You cannot leave. You know too much. You are a loose end." He had to go, and he couldn't take her with him. But he couldn't let her go either. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "Do not try to leave this apartment. Do not touch the phone. Do not go near the windows. Wait for me to return." He left. The lock on the door clicked shut with an electronic finality. Maya was alone, a prisoner in a gilded cage high above the city. She could scream, but no one would hear. She could try to break a window, but they were likely reinforced. She could call for help, but who would she call? The police? Telling them she overheard a Mafia meeting was as likely to get her arrested as rescued. She walked to the window, keeping to the shadows as he'd instructed. The city below was a web of light and life, a world she no longer belonged to. She could try to run. It was a choice. But she remembered the flicker of pain in his eyes when he said Sujin's name. She remembered the cold, assessing way he looked at her, not as a woman, but as a problem to be solved. Running would make her a problem he would have to eliminate. Staying was a gamble. But it was the only move she had. She made a deliberate choice to stay. Hours bled into one another. Maya drifted through the cold, empty space, her adrenaline slowly giving way to a bone-deep weariness. She found a first aid kit in a minimalist bathroom, its contents as neatly organized as a surgical tray. The electronic lock clicked again near dawn. Jin Woo returned. He looked exhausted, the perfect lines of his suit now rumpled. There was a dark stain on the cuff of his white shirt and a shallow, bleeding gash along his forearm. He moved with a stiff precision that spoke of controlled pain. He walked past her without a word and went straight to the bar, pouring himself a measure of the same whiskey he had left untouched at the restaurant. His hand was steady as he lifted the glass. Maya watched him, the competent part of her brain taking over. She saw a problem that needed fixing. She retrieved the first aid kit and approached him quietly. He tensed as she drew near, his body coiling like a snake's. "You should clean that," she said, her voice soft but firm. He looked down at his arm as if just noticing the injury, then at the kit in her hands, then back at her face. The silence stretched, charged and heavy. He was deciding whether to trust her, whether to let her this close. Finally, he gave a curt nod and sat on one of the bar stools. Maya opened the kit. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the wound with an antiseptic wipe. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. He just watched her, his gaze intense. Her touch was professional, impersonal, but the proximity was anything but. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She could smell the faint scent of gunpowder clinging to his clothes, mingling with the cedarwood of his cologne. As she taped a bandage into place, her fingers brushed against his wrist. A current, sharp and unexpected, passed between them. Her breath hitched. She looked up and found his eyes already on her. The air crackled. In that moment, she was not his prisoner, and he was not her captor. They were just two people, alone in the quiet of the early morning, bound by violence, and a secret she was never meant to learn. The next day, the illusion of choice was gone. "You can't go back," Jinwoo stated, not as a suggestion but as a fact. "To them, you are no longer a waitress. You are a witness. My witness. They will look for you." He moved her from the penthouse to a secluded estate nestled in the hills outside the city, a modern fortress of concrete and shaded glass surrounded by a high wall. Her apartment, her classes, her entire life, it was all erased with a few quiet phone calls. Life became a strange routine of gilded imprisonment. She had everything she could want: books, food, clothes, but no freedom. Jinwoo was a constant, silent presence. He worked from an office in the estate, his days filled with hushed calls and meetings with men whose eyes were as hard as his. Maya kept her distance, observing, learning the rhythms of his dangerous world. The attack came a week later. Jinwoo had to go into the city for a meeting he couldn't avoid. For reasons he didn't explain, he insisted she come with him. Perhaps he didn't trust leaving her behind. They were in the back of the Audi, moving through a downtown underpass, when a black van slammed into their side. The world exploded into a nightmare of screeching metal and shattering glass. Before Maya could even scream, Jinwoo moved. He was a blur of lethal grace, shoving her down onto the floor of the car and covering her body with his own. The weight of him was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. Bullets hammered against the armored vehicle like angry fists. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl in her ear. He produced a handgun from inside his jacket with fluid efficiency. He returned fire through the shattered window, his movements precise, economical, and utterly chilling. He was not panicked. He was working. This was his language. A bullet spiderwebbed the glass inches from his head. For one heart-stopping second, Maya thought he was hit. A cold, sharp terror seized her, so potent it stole her breath. It wasn't fear for herself. It was fear of losing him. The realization was a shock, unwelcome and undeniable. His driver, a man as stoic as Jinwoo himself, expertly spun the car around, and they sped away, leaving the chaos behind. They didn't go back to the estate. They went to a nondescript safe house, a small apartment above a laundromat. They had captured one of the attackers, a man who had once been one of Jinwoo's own soldiers. He was tied to a chair in the Spartan living room, his face a mask of blood and terror. Jinwoo circled him, his rage a palpable force, a cold fire that made the air shimmer. "He told them our route," Jinwoo said, his voice dangerously soft. "He sold us out." The man sobbed. "They have my sister, boss. They said they would kill her if I didn't help." Jinwoo's face was stone. He raised his gun. Maya saw the story repeating itself, a man failing to protect a woman he cared about. She saw the ghost of Sujin in a room. She stepped forward. "Don't." Jinwoo's eyes snapped to her. "Stay out of this, Maya. Killing him is what they want," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She was no longer a civilian. She was in this world now. "It makes you predictable. It gets you nothing." She took a breath, her mind racing, connecting the pieces. His sister is their leverage. But she's your opportunity. "Use him," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Use him to get her back. Make him lead you to her. When you save her, he won't just be your soldier again. He'll owe you a debt of blood. He'll be yours forever." It was a cold, tactical thought. It was something he would do. The gun in Jinwoo's hand lowered slightly. He stared at her, a new light in his eyes. It wasn't warmth. It was respect. A dawning realization that she was not just a witness, but a player. She had just crossed a line she could never uncross, offering a strategic move in a game of death. He gave a curt nod to his men. The traitor was taken away, his life spared for a more useful purpose. Later that night, the adrenaline had faded, leaving them both raw and exposed. Jinwoo stood by the window, staring down at the rain-slicked street. "You see things," he said without turning around. "The move behind the move. It's a dangerous quality." "I'm a fast learner," she replied, her voice quiet. He finally turned to face her. The distance between them felt charged, a wire pulled taut. Sujin was like that, he said, the name a confession. She saw the world for what it was. But she was reckless. It got her killed. Because I was too slow, it was the closest he would ever come to an apology, an admission of his deepest failure. I'm not her, Maya said, her gaze steady. He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. I know, he breathed, and the two words were laden with meaning. He was no longer seeing a ghost in her place. He was seeing her. Maya. He said her name, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. Maya, it sounded different. It sounded like a claim. The next day, the war became personal. A message arrived for Jinwoo. It was a single photograph, sent from an untraceable number. It showed the front door of her old apartment. A long, wicked-looking knife was stabbed into the wood, pinning a photograph of her to the door. They knew who she was. They knew where she had lived. The threat was no longer against him. It was aimed directly at her. Jinwoo stared at the photo, his face carved from granite. The cold fury that radiated from him was more terrifying than any outburst. The rival boss, Choi, had made his final mistake. He's not just trying to kill me anymore, Jinwoo said, his voice a low whisper of promised violence. He's trying to take something from me. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw it. Possession. He already considered her his. He began planning the end of the war. A final, decisive strike against Choi. His men gathered, strategies were drawn, weapons were cleaned. Maya listened from the periphery, no longer content to be a protected piece on the board. She heard them planning an assault on Choi's primary warehouse. That's a mistake, she said, stepping into the circle of grim-faced men. They all turned to look at her. Jinwoo raised an eyebrow. It's a trap, she explained, her voice gaining confidence. It's too obvious. He'll expect you there. But I used to work catering for events at the convention center next door. There's a shared underground loading bay. The delivery schedules are a mess. Security is focused on the front. You go in through there, you bypass his main defenses. She was using her old life, her ordinary knowledge, as a weapon in this new one. Jinwoo listened, his expression unreadable. He considered her words, then looked at his maps. He saw the logic. He saw the advantage. He nodded once. Change of plans. The confrontation was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. They used her route, catching Choi's forces completely by surprise. But even with the advantage, the fight was brutal. In the main office, they cornered Choi. The firefight was deafening in the enclosed space. Jinwoo moved through it like a phantom, his focus entirely on his rival. Maya was where he'd told her to stay, behind a heavy steel desk. But she wasn't passive. She was watching, scanning, seeing the angles. She saw one of Choi's men, hidden behind a stack of crates, raise a pistol, taking aim at Jinwoo's exposed side. There was no time to scream a warning. Her eyes darted around and found it, a heavy, red fire extinguisher mounted on the wall nearby. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled from behind the desk, her body fueled by pure adrenaline. She ripped the extinguisher from its mount. It was heavier than she expected, and swung it with every ounce of her strength. The steel cylinder connected with the back of the gunman's knees with a sickening crunch. He cried out and collapsed, his shot going wide. The sound was all the warning Jinwoo needed. He spun, his own weapon firing twice in quick succession, neutralizing the threat. The fight was over. Choi was finished. The room fell silent, the air thick with the smell of cordite and blood. Jinwoo stood over the body of his enemy, his chest heaving slightly. Then he turned and walked toward her. He stopped in front of her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, checking for injuries. His hand came up, surprisingly gentle, and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. I told you to stay put, he said, his voice rough with the aftermath of battle. Maya met his gaze, her own voice shaking but defiant. And I'm glad I didn't listen. The corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. Neither am I, he admitted. It was more intimate than a kiss, more binding than a vow. It was an acknowledgement. She was not a liability. She was his partner. Days later, the empire was secure but scarred. They stood in the penthouse once more, the city lights a silent testament to his victory. The war was won, but the cost was etched on his face. Her old life was an ash heap, a memory that no longer felt real. He turned to her, his expression serious. "I can give you a new life," he said. "A new name, money. A plane ticket to anywhere you want to go. I can make you safe." It was his way of giving her an out, a final chance at freedom. "You didn't ask for any of this, Maya." She looked out at the glittering expanse below, then back at him. She thought of her quiet, simple life before him, the safety of it, the emptiness of it. Then she thought of the terror, the adrenaline, the chilling sense of belonging she felt when he covered her with his body, when she saved his life. "My old life is gone," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "Running is just another kind of cage. Hiding and being safe sounds a lot like being a prisoner." She walked toward him, closing the space between them until she could feel the heat from his body. She looked up into his dark, intense eyes. "What if I don't want to be safe?" she asked, the question a challenge and a surrender all at once. "What if I want to be here?" The question hung in the air, a truth that had been building since the moment she spoke in a language no one thought she knew. Quan Jinwoo didn't answer with words. Words were for lies and negotiations. He answered with action. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was not gentle. It was firm, possessive, and absolute. A silent answer that sealed her choice, binding her to him, to this life, forever. Their hands were clasped together against the backdrop of a city he owned, a world she had just stepped into, willingly and with her eyes wide open.